All right. Hello. I think I'm live. It's hard to tell. Hello, if you're here. Thank you for joining me. If you're watching this later, thanks for watching. The live preview doesn't show my face. Okay, here we go. Okay, hello. I think now things have just started. Maybe things have started earlier. Maybe if you're in chat, say hello and say whether or not you can hear me. So we can see if things are working. Maybe I'll type something. Not. I cannot type anything in chat. Not sure how many people are here. It says between 1 and 4 or 3 people so far. Maybe I can type. No. Well, I'm going to assume things are working. Maybe I can actually load up the stream. Here we go. Okay, good. I think things are working. So, welcome. Thanks for joining me. Let's get started. We're going to answer the questions from the Frankfurt discussion question board. So here's the Frankfurt article on the right. First question. If we think about the applications of the procedure of alternate possibilities, it has consequences if applied in legal procedures or in general. If this is why we are arguing about who to blame, I think it's very important to know the intent the person had. We can never know if Jones would complete the action. We are forced to accept that Black will always have his way. So I would like to ask, how can we apply this principle in law or in daily life if a person can always claim to have a different intent? Frankfurt's conclusion and even change in the principle imply that the intent and the inability of the person doing otherwise matters. If we cannot be sure of the intent, then how can we assign moral responsibility? Yeah, so I think we saw something similar like this when we looked at artificial intelligence consciousness, and we saw the problem of other minds in that article. And Searle said, look, you could be skeptical that other minds exist or whatever. That's not really our question here. Our question here is granting that people have minds. What is it for AI to have minds? And similarly, just like you can never really tell whether people have minds, you can never really tell what somebody's intentions are. You can't scan somebody's brain and find out what their intentions are. But, I mean, that kind of skepticism is rather radical skepticism. You can sort of infer what people's intentions are. If somebody walks into a bank and says, I intend to rob this bank, then probably they intended to rob the bank. If somebody sort of accidentally takes some money from a bank and it really seems like an accident, then probably it was an accident. So it's true we can't always know what people's intentions are, but it's not like we have no way of guessing at this, and the legal system has all sorts of ways to try to figure out what sort of intentions people have. So yeah, in principle it's a problem, but what else are we supposed to do? If you don't pay attention to people's intentions, then somebody who does something by accident is just as responsible as somebody who does something on purpose, and we tend to think that's not the case. So at least in the United States, which I'm most familiar with, we have a distinction between manslaughter and murder. Manslaughter is when you kill somebody on accident. Murder is when you kill somebody on purpose. Murder is much worse than manslaughter. But if we ignore intentions, we say, oh, we can never know what anybody intended, then you'd have to say, oh, everybody's on the hook for murder whenever they kill anybody, even if it was pretty clearly an accident, and that seems maybe too harsh. Frankfurt says, it asserts that a person bears no moral responsibility, that is, he is to be excused for having performed an action if there were circumstances that made it impossible for him to avoid performing it, but there may be circumstances that make it impossible for a person to avoid performing some actions without those circumstances in any way bringing about that he performs the action, 837. In such a case, the person should be held responsible for their actions. However, since the circumstances which were to coerce the person into performing the action did not have any effect on the person's decisions or anything else for that matter, they were as good as non-existent. Hence, in such a situation, did coercion really even take place? Yeah, so he talks about this. He talks about this in the Jones 3 case. He says, can we say of Jones 3 that he was coerced to do something when he had already decided on his own to do it and when he did it entirely on the basis of that decision? Or would it be more correct to say that Jones 3 was not coerced to do what he did, even though he himself recognized that there was an irresistible force at work in virtue of which he had to do it? My own linguistic intuitions lead me towards the second alternative, so the second, Jones was not coerced, but they are somewhat equivocal. Perhaps we can say of these things, or perhaps we can say either of these things, or perhaps we should add a qualifying explanation to whichever of them we say. So, he says, did coercion ever take place? I lean towards no. I, Frankfurt, lean towards no. Maybe you can say yes, maybe you can say no, but you should qualify what you're saying. You should sort of be clear about what you're saying. So, that's Frankfurt's idea. Frankfurt concludes his paper by saying that a person will not be morally responsible for what he has done if he did it only because he could not have done otherwise, even if what he did was something he really wanted to do. The doubt that remained was if one wasn't aware of whether the option they chose was the only option available and they just simply wanted to do it, would that person still bear moral responsibility according to Frankfurt? Wasn't unaware. Oh, wasn't? Yeah, so I think many of our choices are like this. So we choose what to do without thinking that this is our only choice. So if I have potatoes for lunch, I might not be thinking, oh, I can only have potatoes for lunch. I can't have something else for lunch. So most of our choices are like this, the ones where we aren't like forced to do anything or things like this. So, and I think Frankfurt says that, normal choices like that, we can still be morally responsible for those. So yeah, you don't really have to know that something's the only option available. On page 829, we have the original definition of the principle of alternate possibilities, which is that the person is morally responsible for what he has done only if he could have done otherwise. And then in the end of page 838, Frankfurt suggests that instead it should be revised to we are not responsible for anything we did just because we couldn't do otherwise. I understand what Frankfurt is trying to say through his paper, but I'm confused as to what is the difference between the earlier stated principle of alternate possibilities and the revised one, which Frankfurt mentions in the end, because it sounds very, very similar to me. Yeah, so welcome to philosophy where one word difference can make a huge difference. So he says, here's his revised principle. A person is not morally responsible for what he has done if he did it only because he could not have done otherwise. The original principle, well, the original principle, it's different because it lacks the word only. So that's the only difference. That's the mere difference between the two principles, the word only. And so why is only important? So think about, a person is not morally responsible for what he has done if he did it because he could not have done otherwise. So leave out the only. What actions does that cover? So if you're not watching this live, if you're watching this broadcast back, I would pause the video and try to think really hard about what actions does this cover? Which things fall under this principle if you get rid of the only? If you're watching it live, here's the answer. If determinism is true, maybe everything we do. So maybe you could never have done otherwise for anything you do, because determinism is true, and so everything that happens is determined to happen. When I eat potatoes for lunch, that's the only thing I could have done. I couldn't have done otherwise. Why? Because it's determined by the laws of physics. When I do anything, it's the only thing I could have done. Why? Because it's determined by the laws of physics. So if we strike out the only, a person is not morally responsible for what he has done if he did it because he could not have done otherwise. It covers every single thing everybody has ever done, assuming determinism is true. Maybe. And so then we're not responsible for anything because we're not morally responsible for what we did because we couldn't have done otherwise. So the principle of alternate possibilities plus determinism says no moral responsibility. Maybe. So that's radical. Nobody's responsible for anything. But if you had only, what are the things you do only because you couldn't have done otherwise? That's very few actions. When I eat potatoes for lunch, it's not only because I couldn't have done otherwise. It's also because I like potatoes. Or when I, make a video for this class, it's not only because I couldn't have done otherwise, it's also because I want to teach my students, things like this. So when we add only in there, now the principle doesn't cover every single thing we do. Now it only covers stuff you're sort of like forced to do. And how much is that? Well, hopefully not a lot, maybe nothing. Doesn't the argument that a person is not morally responsible for what he has done if he did it only because he could not have done otherwise? Good, so it's following up. Fail when the author mentions the choice of undergoing the penalty always exists. Yeah, so it depends on how you read could not have done otherwise. So he talks about somewhere in the article. Well, let's see if we can find the penalty part. I don't know. Yeah, so I can't find this is sort of scattered throughout the article, but the thought is that maybe it kind of depends on what you say about these cases. There are some cases where you don't have the choice of undergoing the penalty. Someone literally forces you to do something. So somebody grabs your arm and forces you to hit somebody. Then you can't even sort of undergo the penalty instead. But when it comes to cases where there's like a big penalty, like we'll kill you unless you do this, don't you have a choice? I don't know, like maybe not. It's true you have a choice. You could die, but is that like, does that really count as a choice? Is that a viable choice or not? I don't know. We can go either way. Perhaps it kind of depends what you say about freedom and things. If you think about the existentialists think we're sort of like totally, completely free. So of course you always have a choice. That's a real choice. But you might think, no, that doesn't count as a choice. It's got to be something better than like death to count as a choice. Yeah. This question is with regard to a question from the reading quiz. Frankfurt establishes that it's generally agreed that a person who has been coerced to do something did not do it freely and is not morally responsible for having done it. Now, the doctrine that coercion and moral responsibility are mutually exclusive may appear to be no more than a somewhat particularized version of the principle of alternate possibilities, even further asserting that the principle of alternate possibilities may in this way derive some credibility from its association with a very plausible proposition that moral responsibility is excluded by coercion. How is it then that the coercion principle is entirely unrelated to the principle of alternate possibilities, as stated in question 3 from the reading quiz? Yeah, so this is sort of why he introduces the Jones 3 case. So let's go back to this stuff that's being quoted here on 830, 831. He says, it may easily seem that being coerced deprives a person of freedom because it's a special case of being able to do otherwise. Principle of alternate possibilities may in this way derive some credibility from the very plausible proposition that moral responsibility is excluded by coercion. It is not right, however, that it should do so. So he says, oh, it might seem like this. It might seem like it gets credibility from associating with the plausible proposition. But no, it shouldn't do this. The fact that a person was coerced to act as he did may entail both that he could not have done otherwise and that he bears no responsibility, but his lack of moral responsibility is not entailed by his having been unable to do otherwise. The doctrine that coercion excludes moral responsibility is not correctly understood, in other words, as a particularized version of the principle of alternate possibilities. So he says, no, I don't know, you might think this sort of stuff, but no. So that's, you gotta keep reading in the article. The next paragraph, he says, no, it doesn't work. So then, like, why is this? Well, this is what the Jones 3 case demonstrates. Let's assume a software is inserted into Jones's brain that makes decisions authored by another person. Jones's brain is still his brain. That is, it creates thoughts that are independent of and exist along with the software's orders to Jones. Hence, Jones can still have the alternate option not to do what the software is asserting him to do, but assume that the frequency of an order reaches a point such that Jones's reasoning power to counter the order diminishes. He is persuaded into acting, even if it's against his will. That is, he wouldn't act, the order wouldn't muzzle. If he wouldn't act, the order wouldn't muzzle, hence disrupt his life with a new series of orders for every decision he has to make. He finally acts on the order's command despite his unwillingness. However, he had the option to not pay heed to the order, the repercussions of which would be the ordered constant badgering and harassment, driving insanity. Is he still morally yeah, so this is a version of the earlier question. And again, it sort of depends on what you think is really a choice. Is it really a choice to go insane or not? If you say yes, then he's morally responsible. If the answer is no, he's not. How does the principle of alternate possibilities account for the temporal element in any decision that is made or act that is committed? In the examples looked at in the Frankfurt reading, only the immediate situation is taken into account. However, there's a particular sequence of events over time that led up to the situation happening. For instance, say that a person is held morally responsible for being abusive in a relationship. To make this more specific, let us assume that the case was lodged against the person after a particular episode of violence. Will others the said person have interacted with in their life also hold some portion of the responsibility, like the family? Say this person grew up seeing an abusive relationship between their parents. Some media that they encountered in their childhood that developed violent impulses in them, or any other agent who is not directly involved in the incident under consideration but did something in the past that indirectly up. Frankfurt doesn't say anything one way or the other. I think it's compatible with everything he says that these other people are responsible. Also compatible with what he says that they aren't responsible. I'm not sure anything here has to do with not being able to do otherwise one way or the other, because none of this sort of says whether, the parents had to do what they did, whether the media had to do what it did, whether the other agent had to do what they did. And that's the sort of thing we're worried about when it comes to the principle of alternate possibilities. On page 831, Frankfurt introduces the example of Jones, whom he uses to illustrate the different motivations people might have behind an action and whether or not they result in bearing moral responsibility. Suppose Jones weighs the positive and negative consequences of an action and decides based on those not to act. He is then threatened. He remembers the earlier consequences and he decides to act, basing the decision on both the threat and the positive consequences. In this case, is he considered morally responsible according to Frankfurt? On one hand, he would not have decided without being threatened. On the other hand, he does have other motivations beyond the threat. Yeah, this is just a hard case. If you're coerced, well, maybe it's not a hard case. What you say about this just depends on what you say about coercion. Frankfurt's point in Jones is to separate coercion from the principle of alternate possibilities. He says coercion excuses, fine, no moral responsibility with coercion. Principle of alternate possibilities, or lack of alternate possibilities, doesn't work. It doesn't get you out of moral responsibility. People confuse the two. They think coercion is about alternate possibilities, but that's not really it. Coercion is about something similar but different. So, does this count as coercion? Or does it count as enough coercion? I mean, that's an interesting question, but separate. How are the cases of Jones 1 and 3 effectively different? Both cases present the example of an individual to whom the coercive threat in question has essentially no impact on the decision. Jones 1 made up his mind prior to the threat about what he'd do and act on the decision, but this is effectively the same thing as in the case of Jones 3, where the only difference was that the threat did impress him. The end result is the same, however, they both act pretty much disregarding the threat. I'm therefore puzzled about what these two cases illustrate. Yeah, so what they illustrate is that it doesn't matter that you've also been threatened if you're going to do it anyways. So the point is that the threat doesn't matter. Like, that's exactly what he's saying. What the threat does is, for Jones 3, the threat closes off other possibilities, so he doesn't have other possibilities. But he's still responsible. Why? Because, the threat didn't make him act. So this shows that you can be responsible even if you don't have other possibilities. According to Frankfurt, the principle of alternate possibilities should be replaced by, okay, so we've seen this, would not being able to do otherwise include an instance where there is another choice but the person did not realize and consider it? Would the person not bear moral responsibility for an action they only did because for them they could not do otherwise, even though in reality there was another choice? Yeah, so let's see, do I have the Genet article? So this comes up early in the Genet article. He says, look, we should refine this. You have to know about the other possibilities. Otherwise, you're excused. So Genet suggests that the right way to think about this is that, yeah, you have to realize that there's another possibility. It's not enough that it's just out there somewhere. It's got to be also an option you know about. And so that's, I think, the typical response, but you could go a different route. You could say, no, you're responsible kind of, even if you don't know about this. Oops. Yeah, good question. Frankfurt asserts that the principle of alternate possibilities is mistaken on the grounds that unless it causally affects the doing of some task, such that one does a task for precisely the reason they could not avoid doing it, then the PAP is violated, since they may not have been able to avoid it, and yet that was not what caused them to perform the task. They did it of their own volition. Right. So imagine the following scenario. Dave is part of a band of robbers. Dave, with his companions, decides to rob a bank. At the bank, Dave decides that he does not wish to go through with the robbery, but on account of the fact that he cannot avoid it now, he on his own decides to do it. His inability to avoid the case then causes him to decide to change his mind on his own and rob the bank. He has not been coerced. But something external to his will has influenced his will. Does he truly exercise free will? Can he be held morally responsible? I wish to explore this, since it seems a very interesting variant of the examples provided by Frankfurt and is open to debate. Yeah, that's a really good question. So notice, like, here's what Dave can't avoid. He can't avoid the bank getting robbed. He can avoid participating in the robbery, and you might say, well, it doesn't matter that he can avoid participating because it's going to get robbed either way. So what's the harm of participating? A sort of consequentialist or utilitarian view of responsibility says, yeah, like, why would we sort of hold him responsible? Because at this point he can't affect whether the robbery is going to happen. So might as well go along with it for whatever reason. You might have a different sort of view of morality, which says, no, like, being a bank robber is bad, not just because it sort of causes banks to get robbed, but there's something bad about being a bank robber, and Dave can still avoid that. So yeah, I think just in the bare terms of what Frankfurt is talking about, the idea would be, once you sort of decide to, like, Dave does have certainly alternate possibilities. He could just not rob the bank. That's kind of irrelevant for Frankfurt. What Frankfurt is talking about is sort of what he kind of decides to do for his own reasons. It's true that in this case, his reasons are influenced by things going on in the external world, something external to his will. But that happens for everything in the entire... So, like, everything you do is because of some external stuff. Those external things always influence your will. It's when they sort of force you to do something that then the case becomes more tricky. And in this case, Dave, I think, is not being forced to do anything. Like in the example, he's got the option. So Frankfurt at least can say he's responsible. My question pertains to the case of Jones 1, where it is assumed by the author that Jones bears full responsibilities for his actions. We're told that someone makes a threat to him that any reasonable person would submit due to its harshness. In such a case, even if Jones was completely predisposed towards acting upon his original intentions, wouldn't the added factor of the threat a threat of this magnitude inevitably play a part in his decisions, making the act at least somewhat coerced? Because unless he forgets the threat or loses his rationality, the option of not committing the act has been taken away from him through the threat of force. Yeah, so Jones 1 is... he doesn't act on the threat. Yeah, so wouldn't the inevitably play a part in his decision? And Frankfurt says, no, just in this case, the threat did not play a role in his decision. And you might say, no, that's psychologically implausible, or whatever. Nobody can be like this. I mean, maybe. In that case, Jones 1 is just an impossible example. But if Jones 1 is possible, that's the sort of thing we're talking about. On page 832, when Frankfurt talks about fear driving an individual to perform a certain action, he mentions that the individual driven by fear can hardly be said to be morally responsible for his action. Is Frankfurt referring to the fear that individual may fear after being coerced, or is referring to a different kind of fear? Because if it's fear that's produced by coercion, then the individual can still be held morally responsible for his action, as Frankfurt states, even though a person is subject to coercive force that precludes his performing any action but one, he may nonetheless bear far more responsibility for performing that action. What kind of fear could there be other than that of Oh yeah, so the thing he's saying here is just, if the coercion doesn't have an effect on you, then you can still bear full moral responsibility. So this is the case of Jones 3 and Jones 1, where the coercion sort of just, they ignore it. And so in these cases, there is no fear. If it does cause fear, then Sure, you wouldn't be morally responsible. Coercion excuses is the general thought. In the case of Jones 3, Frankfurt says that Jones 3 was neither stampeded nor the threat, nor indifferent to it. He would have submitted to the threat had he not already made a decision that coincided with the one demanded by the threat. Jones 3 is thus morally responsible for what he does. In coming to this conclusion, it seems to me that Frankfurt is assuming that Jones's decision is completely intrinsic in nature, and that Jones's initial preferences and inclinations are completely free of restrictions. Yet this seems to work only theoretically, for in reality there are several external forces that affect one's decision subconsciously. A person may think he's making a decision out of his own free will, but he may be unconsciously swayed by the prospect of conformity, peer pressure, etc. In such a case, is Jones actually free at all to make his own decisions? What degree of moral responsibility could be assigned to him? Yeah, so the Frankfurt's kind of coming at this from a perspective of generally we're free to make the choices that we make. It's like, sure, there are unconscious things playing a role, so peer pressure, conformity and stuff, but it's not like those sort of, force you to do anything. People act against these all the time. Nobody's being sort of like completely brainwashed or anything. So that's the sort of initial perspective. And Frankfurt takes this view because it's sort of the common view, he thinks. Like the common view is that we do make choices and we are responsible for many of our choices. If you say this sort of stuff, this could be a threat to free will that's different from the one Frankfurt's talking about. Frankfurt is talking about alternate possibilities and whether or not those exist. And he thinks those are not, like the lack of alternate possibilities is not a threat to free will. This is a new kind of threat to free will. And we'll see something close to this when we read the Strawson article later. So if you find this sort of thing compelling, then I don't think Frankfurt has much to say to you here. He's going after a different sort of target. So yeah, not like it's a bad question or something, but it's just a separate kind of attack on free will. On the other hand, he will not be morally responsible for what he has done if he did it only because he could not have done otherwise, even if what he did was something he really wanted to do. So yeah, the reformulated principle. By arguing the above mentioned, the author is saying that the only condition that needs to be met for a person to be free of moral responsibility is for them to have performed the action only because they were in a situation where it wasn't possible for them to do otherwise. This holds irrespective of whether the person really wanted to do it or not. However, is it possible that a person would have, in a situation without any coercion, done the same thing? Yeah, I'll keep reading. Their desire to perform the action could have driven them to do it without any threats. The person in this case would be morally responsible. So in the author's proposition, there's no way of ascertaining that the person wouldn't have done otherwise had the circumstances been different. Maybe it's just the fear that caused by the threat outweigh the intensity of the desire to do the same, which is why the reason for the performance of the action was that they could not have done otherwise. This only says that there was a stronger motivation than one's desires to do something that made them do it. In no way does it imply that the desire wasn't strong and the person wouldn't do the action. So wouldn't the person be morally responsible as long as they desire? Yeah, so you could have this view. You could say, hold everybody responsible for anything they would have done out of desire, even if they didn't do it out of desire. That's a bit harsher than Frankfurt's view, but it's not a crazy view. I think the thought is that, I don't know, it's kind of harsh, like it's true maybe that they would have done it or would have at least wanted to do it out of desire, but they didn't. They were forced to do it. And doesn't being forced to do something excuse you? So imagine that you really want to hit somebody. They're just, you really want to sock it to them. Then somebody grabs your arm and punches them. And we come and put you in jail. And you say, why are you putting me in jail? My arm was grabbed and I was forced to hit this. Like I didn't have any choice. I had no alternate possibility. And somebody comes and says, well, but you really wanted to hit them. I don't know. The thought is that this is kind of unfair. Now, when you change really wanted to, you would have hit them otherwise. Yeah, maybe it is fair to put you in jail. Part of the difficulty is the practical difficulty we talked about in the very first question, which is, how do we really know your intentions? How do we know you would have hit them if you didn't actually hit them? So practically speaking, it's going to be tough to put this into play. But yeah, you could have like a harsher view than Frankfurt has. On page 837, Frankfurt says, but there may be certain circumstances that make it impossible for a person to avoid performing some actions without those circumstances in any way bringing up the action that he performs. You say bringing up? No, so Frankfurt says, He says, without in any way bringing it about that he performs the action. So bringing up is sort of like raising the point. Bringing it about is sort of creating something. And he would have done precisely the same thing, and he would have been led or made in precisely the same way to do it, even if they had not prevailed. So yeah, this is a similar case to the one from before. He implies that a person can be driven to perform an action with no relation to the circumstance that's compelling him to perform the said task, and therefore cannot absolve him of the moral responsibility of it. He then further says that the person would do the exact same thing even if he is lacking the circumstances. Doesn't he contradict himself in saying the circumstances are compelling the man to undertake the action? A man dying of hunger could steal food in order to survive. Do the circumstances then not compel him to take the given action? And why would he do the same said action lacking the circumstances? Yeah, so similar to what we said earlier about choice, yeah, depends sort of what counts as choice. You might say, well, no, of course you could not steal the food. You could starve to death. That's always an option, but you might say no. So whether that excuses would depend on whether you actually, have no choice or not. In his article, Alternate Possibilities and Moral Responsibility, contemporary philosopher here, Frank, just strike all that. So just say, Frankfurt describes the case of Jones 3, a responsible person who is neither stampeded by the threat nor indifferent, or a reasonable person who is neither stampeded by the threat nor indifferent to it. Frankfurt remarks that the threat impresses Jones 3 and he would have submitted to it wholeheartedly had he not already made a contradictory decision on the basis of which he performed the action in question. However, I'm slightly confused by this particular instantiation of Jones's thought experiment because I have reason to believe that the person who is neither stampeded by the threat nor indifferent to it is invalid conjecture. By invalid, I mean to say he would never actually be able to undertake any action. Contrary to how Frankfurt describes him, the underlying reason is that if a person decides to perform an action, either on the basis of a previously determined choice or on the face of a looming threat, that person ceases to be the reasonable person described by Frankfurt, for they perform an action based on either of the two available choices, and they could always have chosen otherwise or not at all. I guess my question is, wouldn't Jones 3 constitute what I term an indeterminate person, or a person who would find themselves perpetually paralyzed by the struggle to make a decision aligning either way, because the moment he makes a choice, he would be doomed either to be unreasonable or stampeded by a threat? So I don't understand this part. That person ceases to be the reasonable person described by Frankfurt. They perform an action based on either of the two available choices, and they could always have chosen otherwise or not at all. So yeah, that's true. It's actually not true in the Jones 3 case. He couldn't have done otherwise because he would have been coerced. Although maybe you think coercion doesn't cut off choice, or whatever. Like, just assume he could have chosen otherwise. So let's just say you could have performed an action, you could have chosen otherwise or not at all. Why does that make it unreasonable to do something? So is it unreasonable for me to eat potatoes for lunch because I could have eaten something else for lunch? I guess I'm not seeing the force of the question. Yeah, so sorry, if you're in chat, you can update it. Otherwise, I don't understand this part. I don't know why they cease to be reasonable. Frankfurt retains the assumption that the alternate possibilities argument uses, which is that our actions and decisions are not causally determined. Whoa, does he? I don't know. We'll look at this in a moment. But in the Black example, Frankfurt says that Black can get Jones 4 to do something by giving him a potion, hypnotizing him, changing the function of his neurons, etc. We tried to flesh out these cases in a little more detail by trying to understand how you change Jones's. Wouldn't we find Frankfurt conceding some kind of causal determinism of action? For example, if we agree that changing Jones's neural functioning would be able to change his action, we'd be conceding that neural function determines action, and so in the situation where his brain was untampered, he would not have been able to perform in any other way than his neurons dictated when they were in that state. On the other hand, if Frankfurt decided to get rid of all these ways to make Jones 4 comply and retain only coercion, he would face his own objection that Jones 4 does have other choices. These options are unpleasant, but they still exist. How would Frankfurt? But first, I'm curious. Does he accept that determinism is false? Yeah, so I don't see him accept that anywhere in the article, so maybe I'm just missing it. So this might not be a problem for that reason. But I mean, I don't know, just imagine the potion is an indeterministic potion, or hypnosis works indeterministically, or even changing the functions of the neurons is like an indeterministic process. This is just like a physics question, effectively, so no big deal. How do Frankfurt's scenarios disapprove of this definition of the principle of alternate possibilities when he was always capable of doing otherwise? His arguments were not based on deterministic context questions, but rather on cases where Jones might take an action due to coercion. For instance, if someone makes an accident due to circumstances outside of his control, does that absolve him from moral responsibility on the basis that it was meant to happen? Yeah, so meant to happen is maybe putting it too strongly. That suggests there's some sort of like ultimate meaning. And determinism doesn't mean there's an ultimate meaning. Determinism just means it's all sort of determined by the laws of nature. You could go further and add an ultimate meaning, and that's sort of Frankfurt would deal with that just like he deals with determinism. But just to be clear, we sort of, that's like an extra thing we add. But anyways, yeah, if you do something accidentally, yeah, no moral responsibility. The thought is, it was an accident. If I slip and fall and I land on you and I hurt you, we treat this differently than if I sort of punch you and I hurt you. Why? Because the first one was an accident. You know, I didn't do it on purpose. Part A. I'm not sure why Frankfurt maintains that Jones too isn't morally responsible for his act. So this is on 32. He was going to perform the same act irrespective of the threat. Only the threat is what caused him to commit the act. However, reasons of his own were also causally sufficient to make him do what he did. Why does Frankfurt emphasize the actual case so much if both were sufficient causes? So maybe we'll deal with this before we get to part B. Yeah, I mean, so the thought is just supposed to be, look, Jones too, it's true he would have decided to do it on his own volition, but that's not what happened in this case. In this case, the threat just makes him forget everything. It sort of changes who he is, really. And he's only acting according to the threat. He's being like completely controlled by this coercion. And the thought is that, come on, that sort of thing excuses. If you're just being coerced into doing something, it's not your fault. You're being forced at like gunpoint to do something. We don't hold people responsible for what they do at gunpoint. If we find out they would have done it anyways, maybe we think they're like bad people. So he said, the fact that at an earlier time Jones too had decided for his own reasons to act in this way may be relevant for an evaluation of his character. He may be a far more responsibility for having made that decision. So yeah, he's like a bad person, I guess. But he can hardly be said to be morally responsible for his action, or he performed his action simply as a result of the coercion to which he was subjected. So the thought is, look, coercion excuses. So you could deny this. It's kind of a little harsh. Like if you say coercion doesn't excuse, then, you know, people who do things at gunpoint or whatever, they're fully responsible. But I mean, you know, it's not a crazy position. I think the existentialists might hold that kind of position. So part B, does Frankfurt's argument effectively mean that one is morally responsible for everything one does when one is consciously choosing to act? Like if someone threatened me and I submitted to their threat, and if I didn't, they would have made sure they did, but they don't know. Then would it be reasonable to do? It would be reasonable to do so, but I would still be morally responsible for the consequence because I consciously submitted. Yeah, so not quite. So he says coercion excuses. So coercion can still be maybe conscious. Jones too, I think, is conscious. He's just not like conscious of lots of stuff. So consciousness isn't enough, but we do get pretty close to this. When you do something sort of because you want to, it looks like you're going to be responsible for it, according to Frankfurt's article. So now, strictly speaking, Frankfurt doesn't really tell us how moral responsibility works fully. He says coercion excuses, lack of alternate possibilities does not excuse, and everything else he just leaves open. So you could tell a very complicated story about, oh, sometimes you're responsible for this, sometimes you're not responsible for that, blah, blah, blah. But like, this is sort of the direction Frankfurt's leaning. So the direction seems to be, if you wanted to do it, and that's why you did it, then you're responsible. So it's a bit less broad than consciously choosing, but like consciously choosing to do something you want to do, it looks like that's what Frankfurt thinks will be responsible for. Throughout the paper, Frankfurt discusses a very limited context where Jones's originally did intend to perform a certain action. While there's definitely a set of situations where that could be the case, doesn't the principle of alternate possibilities automatically discount those cases? If one can choose to not perform a certain action entirely, isn't that a possibility itself? Yeah, so Yes. Now, is this a problem for Frankfurt? And I think you'll find the answer is no, not a problem for Frankfurt. And so why would this be a problem for Frankfurt? Well, he's shown the principle of alternate possibilities is false, he thinks. And so it doesn't really matter what the principle of alternate possibilities does or doesn't say about, cases where there are or aren't choices. Frankfurt says that one will not be morally responsible for what he's done if he did it only because he couldn't have done otherwise, even if what he did was something he really wanted to do. Good, so the revised principle we've seen a few times. What happens if one is impulsive and so moved by the first option he saw that he did not care to explore if there were other options? Is he held morally responsible then? Good. So we'll see a discussion of this in the other Frankfurt article. The other, surely it's the yeah, so the next Frankfurt article we'll read will be exactly about this. So excellent question, perfect question to end on, because that brings us to the reading for next week. Does anybody in chat have any questions? If you do, it's sort of a little late to ask. We're really at the end. I'll give you a minute or two. Oh, this says the concurrent viewers is no, okay, well, it keeps fluctuating. So I don't know how many people are in chat, but last chance to ask questions. Oh, actually, no, not last chance. Here's some Genet questions. Let's see, there's 4. Yeah, we have time. I understand that Genet's reply relies on the fact that Jones either did or did not do the action at T1 to assign moral blame. I understand that Genet claims that once Jones does not do the action by T1, he can't be blamed because he's then forced to do the action by T3. Him not doing the action at T1 shows an intent to not do the action. I don't understand how this can work because both T1 and T3 are variable times, which means they can be anything depending on the person and the action in question. How are we determine what time T... Oh, yeah, so just the T1 comes before T3. So T1, T2, T3. And if there are times that don't work, like if T1 is 1926 and T3 is 2184, and the 2 times don't line up, then just don't use those times. Just use the times that make sense of the example, and we'll be good to go. So it's true the example can be nonsense if you just plug in ridiculous times for the times. So don't plug in ridiculous times. In the 3 examples from page 411 onward, great. So let's bring up Genet. 411 onwards. Smith is not considered responsible for not standing up for the queen because there are mechanisms in place such that she would not be able to do even if she tried to. However, an action can be attributed to someone if they have intention to do the act and actually do the action. In this case, not standing up should be attributed solely to Smith, especially because she did not know the mechanism that would have stopped her. The mechanisms that would have thwarted her attempts to stand were ultimately inconsequential in terms of causing this action, though they would have prevented other actions. Their main purpose was a negation of undesirable actions as opposed to pushing through the desired action, and should receive credit only in the cases where they come into effect. Yeah, so good. That's the Frankfurt line, so you're a good Frankfurtian. Frankfurt would say, look, I don't care that there was some device on somebody's lap or whatever that would have stopped them if they tried to stand up. She didn't try to stand up, so there you go. So this is sort of one of the places where Genet and Frankfurt just diverge. Genet says, look, you don't get any credit for sitting still when you had to sit still. And Frankfurt would be like, yeah, you get credit for sitting still if you did it because you wanted to, as opposed to the thing on your lap. So yeah, good. This gets at the heart of Frankfurt versus Genet, and I don't know, tough to resolve. Genet seems to be ascribing more responsibility on the basis of end result. Since responsibility is something that's borne by someone, why isn't it one's intention suffices as a basis for more responsibility regardless of whether the person technically has a choice? The person is unaware of the number of choices and yet chooses the first thing that comes into their head, which is instantly the only choice available. The only choice is recognized as their intention since the number of choices. Yeah, so the first thing, it's pretty harsh, I think, just to hold people responsible for their intentions and not for their actions. If somebody intends to do something very bad but doesn't actually pull it off, you might think it's kind of harsh to send them to jail for many, many years for not doing anything, just having very bad intentions. It's also hard to put this into impact because, as we saw with some of the last questions, it's hard to find out what people's intentions are. But this isn't like a crazy view. You could have this view, which is, look, I don't care about action. I just want to hold people responsible for intentions. And this thing, again, we'll see this with the next Frankfurt article. So excellent question. We'll come to this later. Both the papers tiptoe around what the level of penalty that coerced you into committing the act is. Wouldn't the penalty also play a role in deciding whether the person is morally responsible, not looking at it from the lens of the person facing the penalty, from the lens of outsider looking in the situation? Talk about things in a legal sense. Murder for the purpose of self-preservation is excusable. However, murder for the purposes of monetary gains. Now, according to the murderer, he might have been coerced into committing murder because he had no other means to get money. To us, this coercion. Yeah, so good question. I don't know. It's like a little bit of this is in the previous Frankfurt article where he's like, do we call it coercion or do we not call it coercion? I mean, yeah, so the thought is maybe take clear cases where you know what you want to say about coercion and use those to think about the Frankfurt and the Genet stuff. And then there's going to be unclear cases, but that's sort of, if Frankfurt is right, especially, those are going to be separate from the principle of alternate possibilities. So, you know, there's one question, what do we say about coercion? And another, what do we say about alternate possibilities and free will? And both interesting questions, but I, Frankfurt, am only doing the second one, which is alternate possibilities and free will. So yeah, this is a good question. And when we sort of ultimately want to figure out free will and what people are responsible for, we need to figure out coercion entirely. But the thought is, well, the fight we're having about alternate possibilities, at least as Frankfurt tells it, just isn't about this. It's about other stuff. Good. So no questions in chat. So I think we'll end the video here. Thanks for watching if you tuned in live. Thanks for watching later if you watch later, and hopefully you found this helpful. Goodbye.